Unfiltered, unapologetic, and insightful, this is the Africa Program. From Morocco to South Africa, from Burkina Faso to the Congo, our lens is wide. We connect the dots and spark fearless conversations on politics, art, economics, and security. Join me, Mvemba Phezo Dizolele, founder and managing director of Dizolele Advisory, for fresh perspectives and voices from across the continent and beyond. Coup d'etat have been staples of politics in Africa from day one. Day one being the time that these African countries were achieving their independence. In Congo, within 3 months, the president, Joseph Kasavubu, and his prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, were deposed in September 1960 by one Colonel Joseph Désiré Mobutu. Joseph Kasavubu will be reinstated as president later on, but Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba will die 6 months later. He will be assassinated, his body dissolved in acid in the Katanga province that had seceded and they sought to be an independent country. In Togo, Olympio, the president of the country, will be killed as well, and Eyadema Nyasibe will rise to power. This pattern of coups will happen all over Africa, sometime very bloody, sometime peaceful, and it went on throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, and even in the 80s, where we saw the rise of people like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, in Upper Volta then, but he changed the name to Burkina Faso. And then he will be killed 4 years later by his associate and close partner, Blaise Compaoré, who stayed in power for 26 years. We saw coups in Liberia with Samuel Doe. There it was equally brutal. So after many years of this, we went to a period, particularly following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, where countries seemed to embrace democracy. Benin was actually the leader of that movement there, with Mathieu Kérékou, who had been a president coming through a coup, had been quietly set aside through a peaceful resolution in the national conference, what they call Conférence Nationale Souveraine. So that also set a new trend. We saw this trend succeed in Benin, but it fell pretty much everywhere else on the continent. Today, it seems like we're going back to that trend where, as of late, Benin was just the last casualty. Of course, the coup didn't succeed in Benin, but there was an attempt there. In Madagascar, there was a coup. We also saw this in Guinea-Bissau. So questions, is a coup d'etat politics by other means? Is a coup d'etat an expression of the will of the people? Is a coup d'etat just an expression of the discontent of some branches of defense and security? Joining me to discuss some of these issues as we grapple with them is my friend and colleague Judd Devermont, who is an operating partner at Kupanda Capital, a company that builds business platforms across Africa. Judd is the former special assistant to the President of the United States, in this case Joe Biden, and the senior director for African Affairs on the National Security Council. He is a former colleague of mine at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he preceded me as Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program. As of now, Judd is also a lecturer at George Washington University, teaching a class on declassified analysis. Judd, welcome to the Africa Program. Nice to see you.
Mvemba, thank you so much. We're so excited to talk to you and to get into the weeds on this topic.
You have been an observer as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. You have been working in the field in Nigeria, a country that is no stranger to coups. You also serve in the White House at times where actually coup happens. Not everybody gets a chance to do this, to be there and see how the U.S. will react. Are coups just politics by other means, as Prussian General von Clausewitz will have said?
It's It's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different reasons and expressions that underpin coups. So since the 1960s, Africa's had more than 220 successful coups. And so each of these can be different in terms of whether it is a personal grab for power, whether it is trying to capture and respond to popular sentiment. And so I think it requires thinking about, the context in which the coup happens, the individuals who are executing the coup to really get at that question. I believe, though, in many cases, coups are populism in Africa. There is a lot of popularity for coups. In fact, the coups that you see that are unpopular are a handful, right? I think about Sani Abacha in Nigeria in 93, or Johnny Paul Karoma in Sierra Leone in, I think, 96, 97, or the recent coup in Sudan in 2021. But most of these coups, there isn't a lot of opposition. There's a sense of let's sweep the guys from power. And so it is populism in many respects, or at least it's not opposed. And there's sometimes a hopefulness that a coup will right the wrongs of civilian rule or a previous regime. But again, we've got to get into each coup to kind of answer that question and the particular context in which it arises.
All coups are not created equal. That's what I hear. All coups have some similarities in them. They typically have a context, and that context is one of discontent. I don't think I know of any coup where I think maybe in places like Nigeria or Burkina Faso where they happen so many times. But often there's a context, and that context is highly political in the sense that people are not, the needs are not being met and so on. Is your sense that these coups do they consolidate anything? Do they add any specific value? So we talked about populism, of course. So that, in that sense, the first jolt is like, aha, we need change, and let change come.
Right.
Then what happens from your observation after that first jolt? In fact, before you respond, I was reading when Damiba took over in Burkina Faso. I remember reading the statement, it's always the Council of the Great National Salvation or something to that effect. And I remember reading what they said and comparing it to the statement that Mobutu issued when he made his first coup d'etat. A lot of similarities. You think it was the same editor who had written this thing?
Yeah, I wonder if we put all of the coup statements and all of the names of the different juntas together, and if the word cloud that you create would just be, the same 20 words, because there are some tropes, right? Some cliches about coups, and there's often some very populist steps that a coup government takes almost immediately. Like this was well known under, for example, Murtola Mohammed in 75, that you lock out all the civil servants who show up late to work, right? As a symbol of that, you're instilling discipline into government, right? That's what the military is known for, instilling discipline. So there's a number of these sort of language, rhetoric, and then some initial steps one takes, arresting the former regime officials for corruption or doing show trials. But when you look at the history of coups, it's hard to find examples where they actually corrected the challenges of that they, or the problems that they pinned to the previous civilian or military government. The one that stands out for me in terms of being the exception to the rule, despite it having some pretty bloody origins, is probably Rawlings in Ghana. I think Rawlings, who took power initially in 79, quick transition. I mean, extraordinarily quick, and then handed over to civilians. I think the transition was in like 4 months, handed over to civilians, and then took back power in 81. He ultimately instituted a program of engaging the grassroots, introducing democracy, and then stepping down in a way that I think has been enduring. And I think most other coups, the leaders who take power, unless they're going to hand over power within 2 years, they stay for a very long time. They become corrupt. They become mirrors of what they claim that they were overthrowing. And I don't think that the well-being of the population has improved significantly from them. This is what, by the way, this is what I'm worried about here, is that you're right in this sort of trajectory that you painted about. You get these coups in the 1960s. Most of those leaders stay in power for 30 years, or they're just removed by another military leader and another military leader, and the population isn't better for it. And then you get this interesting moment, I would say, in the late 1990s and most of early 2000s and 2010s, where you have a corrective coup. The civilian government is overthrown. Maybe it's someone like Mamadou Tanja in Niger who got a third term, and you have a quick transition. Outside of Gabon, that's not what we're seeing anymore. The juntas in the Sahel are not talking about leaving anytime soon. They're reformatting and refounding the state. And I think that we're going to see echoes of this decade-long sort of rule under the new regimes. And I'm not sure it's going to deliver any more benefits than the civilian government that they overthrew.
But a couple nuances there I think we need to bring about, Judd. Mobutu and Jerry Rawlings staged 2 coups. Right? Same operator. Mobutu in 1960, Jerry Rawlings later on in the 70s, gave it back to the civilians, so to speak, under pressure, obviously. They don't just like say, here, take it, I don't like it anymore. In the case of Mobutu, people like Larry Devlin, the U.S. Embassy put a lot of pressure and say, we would like to, go back to the barracks. Jerry Rawlings, similar circumstances, a little bit different, but he gave power. But then they come back. They come back and then they stay long enough. So
yes,
Jerry Rawlings, in his case, was able to help the country transition to democracy, but after causing a lot of damage. People were killed, his predecessors, and so on. Mobutu stayed to wage the war. Congo was in the midst of civil war, and then stayed for 32 years. So even in those cases, they still fell under that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a long rule, but I think with the hindsight of history, we can be more generous to Rawlings, especially in his latter years, than we can to Mobutu. Absolutely. And again, I think Rawlings is the exception to this. Some of the long-standing leaders who had been in power for a long time, Moussa Traoré in Mali or Kunche in Niger, they're essentially either overthrown or they're ill and they hand over power to another military ruler. So they don't go voluntarily for the most part. And I'm not sure that they built the state that they claimed that they were going to build. That's Absolutely. What we're talking about right here. I'm reading this great book right now, Samuel Fury Child's Daly's Soldier's Paradise, that came out this year, and talks about this idea of militarism and the vision and the inspiration for it and the ideology behind it. And it is about discipline and remaking the state. But most of these junta governments don't do that in reality.
Absolutely. So I was actually thinking of Guinea as well with Lassana Conte and
yes.
So we also get caught up in a generational divide, right? So these officers come, often they're young. It's very rare that you get some old guy. Even today, the fellow in Niger Tiani is considered slightly older than the others, but he's not that old, right?
He's a general.
Yeah, he's a general as well. So he's had a professional cycle, rising to the top, and obviously held an important position. So they come to power, these colonels and generals, sometimes captain and sometimes sergeant, as it was the case.
And sometimes an NCO.
Sometimes like Samuel Doe in
Samuel Doe, yeah, exactly.
In Liberia. So they come to power. It's almost like, I don't know if you'll agree with this, it's almost like the first steps they take will say quite a bit about where the country is going after that. Beyond, we can expect them to want to stay longer, because at that point, they've got on the back of the tiger. Now they have to continue going. They've frustrated so many people, they cannot stop now. But you have coups who come, people who come and line people along the beach and shoot everyone. So Samuel Doe. You have people who kill the president, Eyadema and others. And then you have those who just send the president to his village and go sit there quietly, don't do anything else. The result is often just similar, as you say, depending on whether at first they do well and then eventually tanks, whether it's an element of absolute power, leading to absolute corruption and all that stuff. Or let's talk about the cases today, because the cases today, at least in the Sahel, they all are within the context of conflict.
Yes.
Conflict, war specifically, is often used as a reason for these officers. Even people like Mobutu was in the midst of civil war. They say the civilians are not delivering. We, the military, are left, carrying the weight. Burkina Faso and so on. Does that make a difference from your analysis?
Well, I think that governments, militaries that take over power when you're in the midst of conflicts, particularly extremism, I think they're able to tap into popular sentiment in a different way. I mean, they sort of layer that on top of more common criticisms like nepotism or rigged elections or corruption and malgovernance or poor governance. But there's an existential threat that they are claiming that they will address. I actually think it's genuine, particularly in the case of the two coups in Burkina Faso. And they believe that you need military leadership to resolve them. And in the case of Burkina, they aren't planning to hand over power until they defeat the extremist threat, which in a country where 60% of the country is under extremist control, or at least has there's sway of extremist groups. That's a long time. That's a pledge that you're going to be in power for a long time. But what I think is important about this moment that you're talking about is how do we respond to it, right? Like, so there's, in the 90s and the aughts, the U.S. government, I'm moving us to U.S. government responses, but U.S. government responses to these type of coups were pretty boilerplate because they weren't coups in the context of extremist threats. I'm talking about Cote d'Ivoire, for example, by the way, which was a general. I'm going to push back.
With Gay.
With General
right?
Gay. I'm going to push back and tell you that it's not that it's just young colonels or NCOs, right? I could give you a list of the chief of army staff and senior generals who took power even in the modern era. But
but I love the chief of staff. Gay definitely, I think, is an exception. They were still young, relatively. I mean, these were young countries. These guys were what, in the 40s?
Yeah, but we're talking about rank, right? Bokassa, Idi Amin, Mobutu, Abacha. These were all chief of defense, chief of staff. They were, there's a distinction, and particularly when you look at the quality of the regime and particularly how they seize power, there's a lot of good research on that the ranking of the officers makes a big difference. You're much more likely to bloodier coups when junior officers are doing it versus senior officers, like Chiani in Niger. Exactly. But anyway, what we used to do is when there was a coup, like General Gay, you would apply these sanctions that are by law. They're called 7008. And the transition generally happened in 2 years. And then you were back in business, right? Now we have generals.
Well, the transition is imposed on them. The world says you need to do this if you're going to have support.
But they do a quick transition, and under pressure. By the way, it's a global norm. Even Russia used to censor coups, whether it was in Mauritania or Guinea-Bissau, and now that's not the case. But anyway, you do the coup, and sanctions are imposed, and within 2 years, you transition. That's different than now, in part because that's not the intent of the current crop, but it's also they face an exigent threat, and it makes it more complicated to think about, well, we don't want to see extremism continue to deepen its roots. We don't want to see greater instability in, let's say, West Africa, but our laws require us to apply these sanctions. So I think there's the changing dynamics presents a policy conundrum for those of us who are friends of the continent and want to see democracy thrive, which I think is actually shared by Africans in the documents and in polling. But in the context of greater instability and real challenges, even the best of times to deal with it, it raises a question about what you do to be effective.
So on that point, Judd, let's look at the evolution of this recognition and reaction.
Yes.
So how has it evolved? You as a historian, I consider as a historian, since we both go and dig into what happened in 1952 and 50. I used to enjoy you used to release all the classified documents we're looking at.
Yes.
I don't know what happened to that. You got tired of it, or
I moved on to Substack.
Okay, I know you moved on to Substack, but those things are still were still of great value. So as I looked at various coups in the past, for instance, Mobutu's coup in 1965, not the 1960, 1965, within a week, a large number of countries recognized the coup, including the Holy See. Right away, they were like, fine. Denmark, all these countries that today we cannot imagine. Curiously, the US never explicitly recognized Mobutu's coup. Of course, everybody says this was a CIA-backed coup, and things went that way. Today, in the United States at least, there is Section 7008 that get triggered right away. How do you see that evolution? Was it the Cold War? Was it more practical approach? How do you see that? Walk us a little bit through your own assessment of it to where we are today.
Well, it's really interesting, and I'm committing myself to kind of pull out some of the press statements, and I'm going to also I want to look at some of the congressional hearings from that 60s, 70s, and 80s periods and see what U.S. officials were saying. I can tell you what they were saying inside government because I have a great memo that I found from March 1966. So in March 1966, by this point, there has been 9 coups in the region. So there has been Nigeria in January 1966. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in March of 1966. You saw a coup in Upper Volta, Central African Republic, obviously in Congo. So a series of coups within a very short period of time. And they write this memo. This is from the State Department to the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. So again, we're under the Lyndon Johnson administration, and say, look, these young men who have taken over have gotten rid of these politicians who are not working in our interest. Can I give you a quote?
Yes, please.
In almost every case, the younger officer has joined with experienced officials to eliminate a layer of politicians who were either corrupt or ineffective. This generation of leadership displays more idealism while also being pragmatic. It is strongly nationalist without greater xenophobia. It is seeking greater efficiency without necessarily being more dictatorial. So this is an internal memo that says, we're excited. And it's, crazy. I found a New York Times article that came out 7 days later that makes the same exact arguments about the forces of moderation coming to power. So in many respects, in this earlier period, whether they officially recognized the government or not, there was some quiet cheering about the removal of Kwame Nkrumah and Modibo Keita and, Lumumba, those who they saw as Soviet aligned or just poor partners for their interests. And I think that changes over time because the promise had worn out, right? Like many of these governments didn't deliver, some more effective than others. There's a declassified CIA assessment about Idi Amin's coup in Uganda that praises it. Good riddance to Obote. Well, that changes almost immediately. Like there isn't a lot of lingering sort of enthusiasm for Idi Amin. We end up closing our embassy in Uganda. It's so bad. But some of them, like, as you know better than I, Mobutu, that continues for many years. But I think that there is less judgment about the coups. There's a sense for many U.S. policymakers that civilians had botched it, and maybe we could do better with this, with these disciplined military officers, many of which, by the way, trained in the U.S. or in the U.K. or in France. I don't think that makes them I don't believe that that's why they did the coup, but I do think that there's a familiarity that is reassuring in those early years.
Yeah, and then Idi Amin and Mobutu trained in Israel. Both of them did the airborne training in Israel, not at the same time, but then there was that element, the Mossad that came in as well for a set of other reasons.
Some of the
So,
francophones fought with the French in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam.
like Bokassa,
Yeah,
exactly. So
yeah,
Bokassa is very much blessed by the French when he comes on board. And some of them were Togo, the fellow from Togo as well. Eyadema also had been
yeah,
in the French army.
yeah.
So
Sergeant.
these were considered just an extension of our guys in Africa. Let's put them on. How does it work in places like Algeria? I mean, Algeria has a turbulent kind of transition of powers, from Ben Bella to Boumediene to. They're not coups in the traditional sense of the word, but people are being deposed.
Yeah, there's I don't have a great insight into Algeria. I think you should do a podcast on why the U.S. Government continues outside of AFRICOM to divide North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. But it has been a challenge for me so it means that North Africa I'm not as steeped in. But we aren't talking about right now rebellions that overthrow governments. Kagame, Museveni, and the law treats it differently, by the way, too. Those aren't, in legal terms, even defined as coups because it's not part of the military seizing power. And I do think that those sort of rebellions, rebel movements that take power, tend to behave differently, at least in the short term and the medium term, than coup leaders do. And I don't have the answers to it. It's a really worthy subject to dive into. So I don't know. I'm sidestepping your Algeria question, my friend.
No, that's fine. I'm just saying that even there were flashpoints, right? In Morocco, King Hassan II escaped a coup, survived a coup in Skirat. And there was they're trying to hijack his plane and so on. But to come back to this evolution of our responses, the responses of various countries, the international community, I'm not the government, but I'm just saying the world's response to this. So you talked about how in the 66, for instance, it's been only 6 years for most African leaders. It's interesting that we'll see them as corrupt already.
Mm-hmm.
They were obviously, the birth of a nation is not easy. And the birth of a nation coming from the independence struggle, putting people who never lived together before except under the aegis of the colonial power, that itself will be a challenge for anyone, anywhere in the world.
Of course.
So as the United States react to these people those ways, we are today. So back then it was the Cold War. In the case of that you mentioned, the Mobutu, the Idi Amin, they were kind of leaning towards the US or France or Belgium, which is an extension literally of the Western power, the same as the US. How does that work within the context of what we call now global power great power competition? Because that's also the context we find ourselves today, with the young guys in Mali, in Madagascar, and other places.
So this is the big part of the conversation right now, is that we created laws in the 1980s, but around coup sanctions, right? So if the U.S. government determines there was a coup, and we've already said there's different ways to sort of think about that. It has to be within the military. It has to be an elected government, a legitimate elected government. That's why sometimes things that sort of look on the surface like coups aren't declared coups. And then you impose all these restrictions, which prevent, for the most part, a direct bilateral assistance. You can still make investments for refugees and some of the humanitarian. You can do some assistance when it comes to like border security. But for the most part, it limits direct security assistance until the Secretary of State certifies that there's been a new democratically elected government. Now, in this moment, we, the U.S. government, the United States, I'm not in the U.S. government anymore, have these requirements, and most of our allies and adversaries don't. There is no requirement within the German government to impose sanctions. Same for the French. They can do it as a matter of policy, but not as a matter of law. And there's an awareness here that either the previous guys, Ibeka in Mali was corrupt. He, really rigged the elections, the legislative elections. His son was benefiting from his rule. He wasn't addressing the security challenges. But we have our laws, and the new governments, at least on the surface, are pledging that they're going to address these problems, and they're getting support. I don't think that they got support prior to the coup, but the Russians and the others run in very quickly because this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for them to make new allies, and that puts us in a bind. I do believe, again, we need to look at what African populations want. They do want democracy. They want democracy that delivers. The record for coup leaders is very poor in that respect in terms of delivery. You can do a trust but verify, but I think that's very hard given the damage that can be wrought in the initial period. And what we did in the Biden administration, we tried to do this a little differently within the limits of the law. So when that coup happens in these countries, you can still have what we call notwithstanding authorities, and you can still do some border security, etc. But once you do those things, Mvemba, you're done. Like, there's nothing left to do until an election. And that was my experience in the 2022 Burkina coup under Damiba, where coup happens. We want to help Burkina. We do all the things we can do within the limits of our laws. And then that's it. There's nothing else. We got to wait until this election that may never, who knows when it will come. We decided when Niger and Gabon happened, well, maybe we need to think about this a little differently. Two things. One, maybe some of the non-withstanding authorities that we have for assistance that we actually, not give, we release it as there's progress towards democratic rule, right? And so, and in fact, Congress made a waiver in the 2023 foreign appropriations that you could actually do a waiver on 7008, and in 2024 they actually triggered that for Gabon. So that was one, creating a step process in which progress gets rewarded, as opposed to we'll see you when you have an election, maybe in 5-10 years. Second thing we did is at the summit, we created the African Democratic and Political Transition, ADAPT program. And so that was extra money that we could give to the embassy, to our embassy, which was short-staffed, to different entities to help this government have the military junta move towards democratic elections and to be more enduring. And so that's what we were experimenting with. I think there's a lot more to look at and to think about what's the right approach here to deal with this problem, because it is, I'm always hesitant to call it a contagion, but clearly there's been 10 coups since 2020 on the continent. And the expectations of what these juntas can do is way overmatched compared to the reality of it. And it's popular. Afrobarometer polling says that 50% of the populations across the continent believe a coup is okay if the civilian government isn't delivering. So we, as partners, have to really think about our toolkit differently. And Congress has showed some willingness to do it. I don't think that means throwing out democracy, but I think it's reevaluating how we get from the moment of the coup to a better place under civilian rules that actually stand this test of time. In Guinea, Burkina, Mali, and Niger, those coups followed civilian rule that only lasted about 10 years. So they're not durable, what has been built.
But the challenge, part of the many challenges there, I think you have alluded to some of them. I think by the time we get to sanction, which is section 7008 trigger, it's a failure of diplomacy, and it becomes much more complicated to engage with these guys, right? There's a sense sometimes that they feel betrayed. A lot of these officers in Guinea, in Mali, Niger, if they were not trained in the US, which many of them were, at least they were trained they joined exercise with Americans. So somewhere along the line, they actually officially were schooled in U.S. approach to defense, to security, human rights, and all this stuff. I remember when Mamadi Doumbouya took over in Guinea, the day before they were just returning for some trip training with American soldiers, and there was confusion there because there were all these American troops who were caught in traffic and they were being cheered, and they feel like this go, oh, are they part of the coup or not?
The Nigerian junta leaders, they were just not Chiani, but Barmu and others had just been at the Pentagon.
Yeah, and I'd met actually a couple of them in Morocco in some exercise there. So there was an element of maybe the US feels betrayed because how can they do this? We gave all the training. But there's also an element of these officers feeling betrayed because they're like, look, we went to school the same. We went to NDU. We went to the War College at Kaila. We understand exactly. We're just applying exactly this because our country is in dire station. This is when we need you the most. And you're sanctioning us. What are we supposed to do now? Right. So it's part of that friction, I suppose. I was not at the White House.
Yeah.
But do you see that where now they feel like we're creating the vacuum that then pushes them to deal with U.S. adversaries?
Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all of these coup leaders, especially those who have trained in the U.S., are very aware of our laws. This is not a surprise. Some leaders that I have talked to believe that their circumstances should override the legal restrictions that we have. Given their views on the previous regime, they're a special case and they shouldn't have this applied. It's one of the reasons why we created some of this additional funding and programming to point out if you think you're a special case and you think you're different, we can react to that very quickly. So that's one. The second thing, which I just want to make sure that we talk about, is where we started, is the context for these coups are different, right? Some of the coups are special forces, presidential guards who believe that the civilian government is failing and they can do better. Some of them are about personality issues, right? Like Chiani was about to get fired by Bazoum and took power. That's actually common in coups where you see that someone's about to get canned. This was true, by the way, for Bokassa as well. And so they take power. So it's an individual struggle.
Yeah, and I think Idi Amin also was in this kind of power struggle with Obote.
Yeah. But here's the last part that's interesting. All of the African countries on the continent, according to academic research, have most of the structural risk factors for coups. That's challenging. And coups are actually easier than one would imagine to implement. Right? There's only a couple of coups, by the way, that have been reversed. Benin is one of them. But there's a great book by a friend of mine, Nanihal Singh.
Nanihal Singh.
Yep, right. It's called Siege of Power. And he looks through all of the coups in Ghana. And one of the coups that I had was totally unaware of was in 1967. And it was a lieutenant who almost took power. It was him and two other guys. They kept telling the rest of the military that they have senior leadership support. They did all of the things that you do. They took over the airwaves, etc. And they were this close to actually taking power when a couple of elements of the military decided to do a counter coup. And that sits with me because what Nanihal says is that the military, above and beyond, doesn't want to be engaged in fratricide. And so there's a bandwagoning effect that happens very quickly. And so you make this point about what is the work that can be done diplomatically before you get to a coup. And I think there's a lot of things that one can do. But let's not discount that some of this has nothing to do with the context. It has to do with personal rivalries and ambitions. And it's quite easy to do. It's surprisingly easy to do. In ways that I had not anticipated. Now, you can move your capital from Lagos to Abuja. That helps. I mean, there's different things you can do to coup-proof a regime. You can pretty much redesign N'Djamena in a way that makes it a fortress. But it's actually much easier. So the interventions, the pre-coup interventions are more challenging. And part of that is knowing what the norms on the other side of the coups are. If you understand that there isn't much room for cooperation and normalization and legitimization, if you do the coup, I do think that is one limitation. Obviously, your population being opposed to it, which rarely happens, that is also one. Ibrahim Babangida of Nigeria talks about how he always planned the coups. He had been involved in many coups. When he thought the moment was ripe, that was his view. But there's a holistic picture that we have to take, Mvemba, about pre-coup environments, what it takes to do a coup, and then what are the consequences on the other side, and what are the interventions we can make so that the return of civilian rule is not just swift, because I'm okay if it not being swift. I do want to plan, and I do want to help to make sure it's durable. By the way, from that 1966 paper, because we're running out of time, I will make this last point. It says, these immediate results all favor our own interest in Africa. We should not, however, be misled into thinking that this new atmosphere will necessarily produce long-term improvement.
This is the U.S. government.
This is the same memo.
The same memo that you're reading. Yeah, but one thing we've seen as these coups sprang over the years, over decades, is also the creation of presidential guard. A lot of presidential guard sprang, and unfortunately, it led to the ethnization a lot of military, where you end up having this mono-ethnic unit that's tend to protect the power that is in place. Which has become problematic. One thing I want us to think about as we close, you talk about this officers training in the U.S. There's a story that a friend was telling me, after one coup in one of these countries, a U.S. official shows up and is giving them all the stuff why you need to stop. And before even the person got to the section 7008, this officer was like chief of staff or something, pulled his memoirs from Carlisle and he's written his memoirs on his dissertation on section 7008. He says, you passed this because of Honduras or El Salvador, whatever is happening. The situation in Salvador and Honduras are very different from what we're experiencing here. So it was just to support what you said.
I hadn't heard that.
The guy was saying, I know, I wrote on this. This was my dissertation at the War College in the US, but I'm telling you, that's not here. So one thing I want to close up with, since we're coming close on time, I read the psychological profile of Mobutu by the CIA right after he came to power. Literally, he comes to power in November 1965. 66, there's this profile of him. And it says all this, and then it says he's going to be a dictator. Literally. But yet, the US still support the guy all the way 32 years later. What do you make of these psychological profiles? And you've written a little bit on the briefing that the US president gets on this. But this is the profile of the coup leader.
Yeah, well, this is, and maybe we'll come back to this at another point on your podcast, but this is the difference between analysis and policy. You know, it is the job of the analyst to call it like they see it, to give objective analysis. And in this case, they were right. You did become a dictator. It is the prerogative of the policymaker to decide how much they care about that implication, right? Whoever read it, if someone senior read it, said, I hear you, but either A, I disagree with you, or B, I hear you, but I have other interests that outweigh that. And that's the back and forth. You desperately need the CIA and the analytic community to talk truth to power, hopefully to be convincing about what the implications are of what you are laying out. And then it's the policymaker's responsibility to decide how to act upon that information.
On that note, Devermont, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us. We would like to bring you back. I think, as you can see, this is a 2-hour session we should have, not a 45 minutes. Judd Devermont, operating partner at Kupanda Capital, former special assistant to the President of the United States, Joe Biden, lecturer at George Washington University. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Mvemba. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us. We would like to continue this important conversation. Please subscribe to the Africa Program podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you like to listen. Our analysis and reports are available online at www.dizolele.com. That is DIZOLELE.com. The Africa Program podcast is produced by Sarah Baker and Mvemba Phezo Dizolele. Until next time.